Hey, fellow small brain. Wait. Before you click that, I'm actually praising you. Because do you know that Einstein brain is actually smaller than average? He also famously don't like to wear socks because of his big toes. He sleeps a lot, 10 hours a day, and yet he loves to drink coffee. And of course, just like any normal person would, the opportunity of changing your career path would also appear at least once in your life. Maybe you were a scientist who once wrote 4 major scientific papers in just 1 year and gave all your Nobel Prize money to your ex-wife, or you could be a president if you had grabbed the chance. Nothing out of the ordinary really, just like his normal and mundane social life, where one of his friends murdered someone in broad daylight. Okay, why I'm telling you all this? It's a bit complicated. Let me explain. Years ago, I heard Giga said that he watched an anime called Realist Hero. It mentioned Machiavelli. This got him wanted to read more ideas from Machiavelli. This piqued my interest, because I don't recall nowadays anyone would call themselves a strong supporter of Machiavelli. And I have a gut feeling that the anime would not be able to portray the mannerism that Machiavelli was saying. In addition, it just so happened that I actually read The Prince a long time ago, and I distinctly remember the only thing I can agree with Machiavelli for sure is that don't ever use mercenaries. So because of all these reasons, I decided to watch it. And let's just say that if there are any Realist Hero fans out there, I'm sorry, I didn't enjoy it. I couldn't finish season 2. I will try to explain why and keep this part short because this video is not about Realist Hero. First, a minor pointless remark. I'm not sure why the prince is this fake. If you really want to, you could read it within 1 day. Second, the serious remark is, I would want to coin a term specifically for this video. It's called pseudo-cynicism, where the story might have the idea of portraying something or someone as cynical at first just to re-establish their action as always justifiable and morally righteous in the end. This is important because a controversial idea from Machiavelli is that if you really have to choose between being loved or being feared, you should always choose for being feared by your subject. What's more, a popular interpretation for the work of Machiavelli is the end can always justify the mean. The method is not that important, the point is the goal. However, let's just say that in Realist Hero, I never felt this kind of complexity to the character. Every questionable actions would always seem to be justifiable by the later actions, which causes them to be always likable. To add on, there is something more than just the portrayal of Machiavellianism. I still remember there is this one episode when characters were being asked by the protagonist, do they believe in religion? They brush the idea of religion as just superstition, but they live in a world where magic exists and dragon exists. Somehow it just so happened that the closest ally of the protagonist would not believe in religion. I think first of all, this happened because of plot convenience. Without spoiling much, let's just say that in later part of the episode, we will find out that the problem that the hero was facing was indeed not related to God. Another reason why I think this happened is because the historical period that we are living in affect how we write religion in media. Most people in real life now don't have any religious belief, so of course it would be normal to assume the mannerism of the character that the author create will also reflect modern tradition. But just like what I've mentioned, the setting of the anime is a world where magic and dragon exist. The way the anime just announced them as atheists made me feel like the anime is just modern people trying to do roleplay in a fantasy setting. It is slightly less believable and intriguing. This got me thinking, is there any anime or manga that have a historical theme which successfully portrays the mannerism of the past? Can they also give me a sense of history? When you are looking back on history, there is a density, a weight to it. History is not just a list of events. Character is much more complex than you thought. Just like Einstein. You might just know him as a physicist, but in reality, he's just like you and me. He has his goofy side of not wearing a socks, and at the same time, his personal life is not as straightforward as we think. So with that in mind, I went on a mission to read and watch two franchises that I heard are great. First is the manga Kingdom, second is the anime Vinland Saga. I want to clarify, I've only read the Kingdom up to chapter 412, but I think I've read enough to get a sense of where the manga's content is aiming at. And as I'm writing the script, season 2 of Vinland Saga is still airing. I'm still waiting to watch episode 21. So, start off with Kingdoms. My verdict is entertaining, but not what I was looking for. Kingdom is a manga that depicts what happened around 2,300 years ago in China. Our main protagonists are Rinxin and Ise. They were living in a state called Qin. The former wanted to be the world's greatest general, while the latter wanted to unite all the state and become kings of Qin. They were living in a period where China was being divided into different smaller states due to constant infighting during the Warring State period. Side note, it is kind of awkward because I actually know how to pronounce the name in Chinese, but sometimes it sounds way too different from the English translation. So I'm in a weird position where if I say the Chinese name, you might not know who I'm referring to. But at the same time, the English name is so different, so I might butcher the translated name instead. Anyway, there were moments where the manga tried to depict important events which did historically happen. For example, multiple states unite against the Qin state, the state where the protagonist belongs. The various love affair of the queen was mentioned, and the fact that one of the protagonists was once a hostage of another state. These are things that did happen. There might be some minor difference here or there compared to the real history. For example, in the coalition arc that I've just mentioned, where multiple states against the Qin state, in the manga, it tries to depict Riboku as the mastermind behind this whole event. But in fact, to my knowledge, it was Hawken who mainly led the invasion. Because my memory of Chinese history is fading away, so when I was reading this, I was delighted to relearn or discover some knowledge. For example, the mother of Ase, she was the queen that I was referring to that has multiple affairs with men. I kind of remember she had affairs with men, but I don't think I remember not only did she have affairs with multiple people, but she also chose to establish a new kingdom with her newfound man. This basically means she was going up against her own son. She chose her new husband rather than her son. If this is not the ultimate betrayal, I don't know what is. Imagine you had the chance to inherit a company from your parent, but your mom hates you so much that she didn't even bother to go through all the legal documents to trick you into giving up your share. Instead, she went away with your secret stepfather and opened a new company while stealing your company's resources. And how did your mom even find this new stepdad? I'm not spoiling it, but trust me, go read Kingdom. You would have never guessed why all this happened. It was way more bizarre than you think, and things that you think are fictional might be true. Just to give you a little bit more example to illustrate what I meant, it is hard to believe what is fictional and what is true. In English, the kingdoms that the queen created is called Ai, but the actual Chinese word is this in Mandarin. It is called Ai. In Cantonese, it is called Oi. Now, let me tell you something. This name is not normal for a country. In fact, it is not normal for anyone to have this word in their name. But just somehow coincidentally, the name of that stepfather has this character in it. So I was fact-checking how much of this is real. Apparently, both of these names were true. Now, you might be thinking, so what exactly does this character mean? A person who is indecent. This is the meaning of the character. But who in the hell would want to call themselves indecent person? Which is why some argue this might not be the real name. It could be Ase hate him and his country so much that they chose this derogative name to hide his identity. Imagine not only have you failed your rebellious actions, but your name and your established country are now being overshadowed by defamations, and no one now knows the true origin anymore. This is literally what it means when people say history is messy. So why do I say this manga was not what I was looking for after all this? This is mainly because even though it gives you a glimpse of how complicated history can be, the characters themselves don't act like they are from that time period. Kingdom overall just focus on one part of history, which is warfare. After all, the story focuses on how Rinxin wants to become the greatest general ever. So the storyline feels like a mixture between shonen anime and wuxia novel. And you can tell the manga focuses less on realism and more on dramatic display. The story of Rinxin trying to become the greatest general ever is similar to Naruto trying to be the best Hokage. For example, the way they describe general is quite anime-like. There's different types of general. Some are more intuitive than the other. Some focus on defense but not attack. It's like a shonen anime trying to create different types of fighting style. Also, there are tons of 1v1 showdown. Oftentimes, important character will only die from this instance. But as we all know, warfare is not like that. Injury could be unexpected. Hannibal didn't lose his eye in a duel. He lost it to disease. Sometimes, generals really do just die from random arrows. And Rinxin has the typical anime protagonist aura. Someone who could fight stronger against greater enemies. Plus, he never gets tired or was affected much by his injury. And the way they describe war also leans more on the side of spectacle. War is usually won by outsmarting the others. For instance, there's this one time the Qin army was ambushing the opponent. It seems like it was going to work, but as soon as they got down the valley, they became the one being ambushed. But then, another force of Qin army showed up to ambush the ambushing army. Just when you think it's over, the Qin army got ambushed again. Now with no chance of winning, the Qin army escaped and revealed somehow they had a plan B and had already built a small fortress inside a forest. And I haven't even mentioned there was just one small fight encounters out of the larger battle. This story might be cool and all, but in reality, not all fights are won by smart decision. Sometimes the weather is bad and screw you up. Sometimes it could be you and your opponent make some stupid mistakes. And sometimes it is really up to the morale of the soldiers. As for the reason why I would say some part of it is like wuxia novel, is because there are characters in this manga who use methods similar to depictions of qigong in many wuxia novels. The numerous killer organizations that appear also resemble different kind of kung fu style that you see in wuxia novel. And at last, why I would say it is not aiming for realism, and this is not the manga that I was looking for, is that it has a section depicting people who are living in mountains, and all of them somehow wear masks. And this group of people somehow has fine architecture around the mountain cliff while living in 300 BC. The manga also has a bit of pseudo-cynicism that I was saying. At the very start, it depicts the protagonists don't care much about each other than their own interests. Character outright said they were just using others for their own benefit. But I feel like as the story progressed, they drop off this tone completely. And whenever something bad happens, i.e. people using others for their own benefit, it would always somehow be some atrocious behavior. And the protagonist would call them out and demonize their actions. Basically, another way to show why the main characters are likable and why they are the heroes of the story. But let's just say that if you really look at what happened in real Chinese history, the main characters sometimes aren't as good as they look. So, moving on to Vinland Saga. Vinland Saga, in a lot of ways, resemble the things that I was looking for. A simple word could summarize 70% of the show. Viking! The premise is a coming-of-age story with vengeance being the underlying force. The main character, Thorfinn, and his personal growth is our focus. It is safe to say Vinland Saga has a more mature tone instead of this slightly childish innocent world feel where being the greatest general is similar to being the greatest athlete. There were ambiguity in the actions of the characters that question the audience's binary presuppositions of good versus bad. It doesn't shy away to show the atrocity of the Vikings. But since this video is about history, I should focus more on how it depicts the mannerism of characters and historical events of the past. I think Kingdoms did a better job at portraying the macro movement of history, since most of the time it depicts famous war and how these major battles shift the power balance of the past. Whereas Vinland Saga, let's be honest, the second season is just farming simulator. If you haven't seen the show, this might come as a shock. How could a coming-of-age story go from vengeance to farming? But if you have seen it, it totally makes sense. The story of Vinland Saga was never about these big battles. It's the cultural history of the Vikings and the subtle thought of the characters. I would say Vinland Saga is better at portraying history through the subtle mannerism. Sure, you might say, why there's a scene where protagonist knows how to do CPR? There are also noticeable anime tropes that makes you realize this is obviously historical fictions but not real history. Like, being a strong anime character must mean that he could take on the whole army, and is a bit of meathead who just like fighting. But overall, there are small and subtle ways that depicts the grand history. Like the historical cultural shift of believing Odin and Thor to believing in Christianity. It never mentioned any policy change which said, from now on, we would build more churches or change the state religion. But rather, it focused on the little characters. Characters who we didn't even know that started to question their own belief. Like Thorfinn, who secretly listened to the teachings of Bible. It also mentioned the cultural practice of the Viking, like when will they take showers? What is the nuance of being a slave in the past? Just because they kept you well fed and be good to you, it doesn't mean that it is a good practice. But by far what I like the most is the minute details about the characters that implicitly build the world. The place Finland, where Thorfinn wants to go, is definitely a reference to the Vikings who discover America. The sword that the character possesses imply he has been to the Ottoman. And the way the character Askeladd armored himself and revealed that he spoke another language, all these are small details, but at the same time they show you the vastness of history. I also want to touch up on characters' inner thought. There were moments in which character did the opposite of what he has been told. And just when you think they would talk about it again in the future, the show just simply ignored it. You were just left there guessing what could have happened and what was the motivation behind. But at the same time, isn't this just like real history? We could always speculate why people did what they did, but some information simply got burned out or left behind by time. It also shows how real human beings are complex. Just because you told them to do A doesn't mean that they will do it. And another way Vinland Saga mimic real history is that character just comes and go. People that you thought is important were simply left behind or never mentioned again. But that's a good thing in Vinland Saga. It's not a criticism unlike other stories where people complain the author forgets about certain characters. The way Vinland Saga forgets its character feels natural. Like the priest who was always drunk in Season 1 but was never mentioned again in Season 2. In Season 1, Thorkel caused a lot of troubles, but in Season 2 he was barely present. They were gone because they have fulfilled the purpose in the story. The priest signifies the change in religion. The lost importance of Thorkel expressed how warmongering geopolitics is not the focus in Season 2. Again, this is like real history. People comes and go. Some figure might dominate the narrative of the world when they were young, just to be forgotten when they slowly wither to death. And some were always mentioned, here and there, come and go, but no one really knows is he or she real or if they are just make-up characters. Not everyone enters the stage of history. But is it possible to find something that combines the narrative of a great shift in history, like Kingdoms, with small intricate details of the characters like Vinland Saga? Let me give you a real-life example of what I was looking for. A proved himself a selfless, calm, hardworking, good-hearted, conscientious man, who was highly esteemed by everybody, and that is my heartfelt desire, therefore, to intercede for him. This is a letter written by none other than Einstein himself. The person A that he was describing is none other than the murderer I said at the start of the video. So what happened? Why this seemingly good man, liked by many, suddenly commit a crime? That's because murder is not the right word. Assassination is. The societal context to the act of killings can mean a lot of things. Both murder and assassinations imply someone has been killed, but needless to say, it holds different emotion and has different impact on public perceptions. The person A refers to Frederick Adler, a physicist and activist who chose to assassinate the minister-president of Austria because the government was trying to limit the university's ability to discuss public matters, and he also wanted to protest the ongoing war. Not sure have you ever heard of this war? It's called World War I. So you see, by simply writing this letter, you could argue Einstein is making a stance on his own. And this simple letter at the same time shows how Einstein treats his friend. It provides commentary on the private life of an important historical figure while giving you an understanding on the bigger pictures of history. Einstein has been through a lot. He was living in a tumultuous era, and this would also not be the only world war he experienced in his lifetime. He also would go on to experience the destructions of atomic bomb, which he thought was a mistake. So, is there such story out there that could depict the grand narrative of history through some small interaction? For that, let me introduce a scenario to you. Imagine you are walking in the city of Japan. Someone was heading toward the train station, but their books got knocked down by a stranger. Another man saw this and decided to come by and pick up the books. So, let me ask you a very interesting question. Who is the protagonist? Is it A man who got famous later by writing a book about cat? Or B, a man who isn't Japanese but Korean, who was born as a noble, a man that would later assassinate a high-ranking Japanese official in Chinese train station? Or C, a man who is a second lieutenant in the army and would later on start a war in Japan that I kind of have mentioned already, the Second World War? The answer is a man who wrote a book about cat. His name is Natsume Soseki, a very famous Japanese writer who was born in the 1867. And you might have seen him before even if you have not heard of him, because he is on the Japanese 1,000-yen bill. But I bet any one of them could have the potential to be a protagonist. The Korean man is called An Jung-gun, and just like what I have said, he would later assassinate a Japanese official. So you might be thinking, is he going to kill the seaman? It is understandable to have this deduction, but no, because the seaman is none other than Hideki Tojo. He will later be hung to death as a Class A war criminal after the war trial. And I think I need to mention, this manga is not a fictional piece of work. It is a biography. The name of this manga is called The Time of Botchan. The setup of the scene that I have just mentioned is just Natsume Soseki trying to do a farewell for someone he knew, and he just suddenly bumped into someone. This whole scene was within one page. Then the manga just told you, oh, by the way, those two guys that you have just met One of them would assassinate someone in Harbin, and the other guy is called Hideki Tozo. After these expositions, it straight up goes into the next chapter and talks about the cat that inspired Natsume Soseki. Just like that, a simple act of bumping into someone shows you how complicated the world was in Meiji era. And this might not affect you on the same level, but let me tell you something about recent Chinese history that I still roughly remember. Without getting too much into the detail, one of the reasons why China now is not being ruled under by a king from Qing dynasty is because of a man called Sun Yat-sen. He started numerous attempts to overthrow the kingdom, and one of the major reasons why he started his activist life is because the Qing dynasty lost in the First Sino-Japanese War. Because I was learning about Chinese history, so they always focus on Chinese historical figure. But then, now I know that one of the major Japanese officials who was in charge of the First Sino-Japanese War is called Ito Hirobumi. The reason why I would know this is because he was shot. Guess where? A Chinese train station in Harbin. It is the Korean man that I mentioned before that shot Ito Hirobumi. So it kind of hit extra hard for me when I read this, because suddenly I was able to connect some thoughts together and see how things were intimately tied together. Never in a million years would I think that the Chinese history that I learned years ago will have something to do with a Japanese manga that talks about Japanese writer but somehow magically links to a Korean man that shot a Japanese official. This got me full circle and understand how historical events affect my life. And guess what? That's not the end of the story. We will see the Korean man in the manga again, but this time the focus is on a Japanese guy called Shiro Hori. Side note, I'm trusting Google Translate for the man's name because I could barely find anything about him. Anyway, guess what he did? He saved the Korean man from a failed assassination attempt. Somehow, not sure why, he was just willing to save a stranger from killing Japanese official, which ultimately led him to his successful assassination attempt in the future. But guess what? Who do you think is the friend of Shiro Hori? Natsume Soseki. Like, it's all come full circle. And you will have never guessed how Shiro Hori became friends with Natsume Soseki. It was simply because they got too drunk at a bar one night and was locked in the same police station. The craziest thing is, there were 3 more people in the cell, and each of them have their own story to share, and they are all connected to the main story. Again, this all happened because of a stupid bar fight. As if this is not even complicated enough, guess what Shiro Hori became in the future? He became the leader of a Yakuza gang. And that's not the end. Something else also happened. Let's just say that there were ongoing conspiracy after an earthquake struck Japan. The conspiracy targeted Koreans who were living in Japan at that time, which eventually led to a street riot. And in order to stop any more innocent Korean being killed, Shiro Hori chose to suppress the ongoing riot. This ultimately led to the tragic event of him being killed by the rioters. The final act of his life, the final panel, gave you a sense of wonder. Is that why he chose to do the things that he did? How come a man like this became a Yakuza leader? It is things like this makes you understand there's so much more to human thoughts. It is really hard to interpret someone's actions by looking back into history. And I need to once again mention, the protagonist of this manga is Natsume Soseki. It's not all these other characters that I have just mentioned. Isn't it crazy? Just a side character alone in history could give you so much room for interpretation. And since this manga is about Natsume Soseki, let me tell you a small sections within the manga. I think this perfectly encapsulates the limit of imaginations in writing historical fictions, because we are product of our time. There's some details that will always get lost, some incidents that are beyond writer's mind. So one day, when Natsume Soseki was teaching English to his student, he just suddenly yelled, "You!" It was out of his character to do so. Then he scolded a student. He said, "You are a student with no courtesy. How could you imitate the British?" So, what do you think the student did? Is it snoozing during lesson, putting gums under the table, or drinking tea and eating biscuit during class? The answer is none of the above. He simply accused him for putting his hand in the pocket. It sounds quite absurd, right? Why make a fuss about it? It's just someone putting his hand inside a pocket. But that's the point. That is the reason why I said there are things beyond the imaginative mind of the writer. If we are using a modern cultural practice to write and understand stories, we would have never thought this was considered impolite in ancient time, unless we have an accurate account of real story like this. Historical fiction writer could never just make up some cultural practice and say this was how people act at that time. Because if it is too odd with no factual basis, people would just think the story is excessive and unnecessary. From this incident, it also exposed a lot of other things, like why the impolite act of putting a hand inside a pocket would be associated with the British. There are so many countries in this world. Is this a common stereotype that the Japanese had at that time? Or is it something else? For those who don't know, Natsume Soseki studied in the UK before he came back to Japan. He considered his study in UK a failure. In one of his works, he mentioned, "The 2 years I spent in London were the most unpleasant year in my life. Among English gentlemen, I lived in misery, like a poor dog that has strayed among a pack of wolves." How much of this misery was caused by the cultural practice that he disliked, like people putting their hand inside pocket during class? And this was probably just one of the small things out of the many. And that's not the end of the story. Guess why the student's hand is not visible? It's not because he put his hand in his pocket. Another student stood up and defended the speechless student. You can't see his hand simply because he doesn't have one. So the whole situation changed 180 degrees. For me, it got me thinking, oh yeah, the medical condition at that time is nowhere near us. People were more prone to injury and disease. Is that why he lost his hand? I didn't get my answer, just speculation. But again, that's something we often overlook when writing fictions of the past. People died earlier in the old days. Most of them probably lost a teeth or two inside their mouth. And I know that this part of the story definitely happens in history and it's not some made-up event in biography because it mentioned the two students' name. And apparently, the author even mentioned they got the wrong student's name when they were serializing the story in magazine. Because after the wrong version was published, the family of the student who was supposedly missing a hand sent a photo to the authors. In that photo, you could clearly see the student has both of his hands intact. So the authors checked again and realized it was another student with a similar name. After the big reveal, the way Natsume Soseki handled the situation also gave us more insight to the character's personality and perhaps the teacher-student relationship in Japan. The prudent Natsume Soseki felt panic and just stood there with both of his hands on desk for a long time. Then he said, "I said some unintelligent nonsense during the lesson. Now could you please take out your left hand which is missing?" Then everybody laughed. He still felt ashamed, but for now, the thing is over. This manga is full of small stories like this to connect the historical background in order to give you insight into the main character's life. After reading this, you will understand the creation behind their artwork. This manga is so full of detail. It is no wonder why the manga won first place, for Tatsuka Osamu Cultural Prize in 1998. It took literally 12 years for the creators to make this manga. And do you know what is the craziest thing? All these things that I have just mentioned were covered within the first volume of the manga. And these mangas have 5 volumes, covering 4 different Japanese influential figures during the Meiji era of Japan. So far, I have read the first 2 volumes, and it is a must recommendation for people who like this kind of stuff. The only bad thing I had to say is, its weakness and strength are simultaneously the same. If you know the character that the manga was describing, then the manga works better for you, because it dives into the psychologies of the character to hint at why they might have created the artwork that you have seen. But if you don't, then you might get confused or don't understand the gravity of the situation. In addition, there were too much details, too many characters to follow. You might feel like the manga is throwing a bunch of information to you at once. And with each volume being only 100 pages, you might find yourself getting fragmented pieces of information here and there. So that's the end of the video. Remember to like, share and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Bye.